Father, thank you so much for the way you love us. Thank you so much for the family of Abraham and his sons, his children, of whom we get to be spiritually called that. Father, thank you for the Bible where we learn about this. And Father, be especially with Kevin tonight as he presents your word to us. Thankful. We are thankful for your word. We're thankful for Jesus. And in his name we pray. Amen.
Amen. So tonight, we're looking at Isaac. And Isaac's story starts earlier in Genesis than what that says, because Isaac is promised to Abram and Sarah before chapter 21. I didn't pick Isaac because of the topic. I actually picked Isaac because I knew I was going to be in town today. So, like Scott said, I'm not sure when I'm here and when I'm not. And then I thought, well, Isaac shouldn't be hard. Isaac is, he's one of the patriarchs, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. This shouldn't be difficult. And then I started looking at Isaac, and I'm like, there's really not a whole lot about Isaac in there. There's about Abraham and Sarah and Isaac coming to be, and there's about his servant going and finding his wife, and then there's a lot about his sons and their interaction, but there's not just a great amount of material. And you go, well, that's 14 chapters there, and you said it started earlier, but again, that encompasses the promise and his children. And so to talk about Isaac, we kind of need to back up and look at mom and dad. Go ahead and go to that next slide, if you would. It's probably really hard to see, but it's kind of one of the family tree genealogies, and it's got Abraham. His father was Terah, who, I don't have that page. There's that page. And then his brother Nahor and Haran, and of course, we know about Abram and Lot, and that story's all in there as well. But Abram is really tied to his brother Nahor more than I thought he was, through his children and grandchildren, because it is Nahor's granddaughter, that would become Isaac's wife, Rebekah. And of course, in the story of Abram, you have Sarah, which twice he goes and says to a king that this is my sister. And was really not honest because she was his wife, but she was also his half-sister, the daughter of his father from a different mother. So kind of things happened back then that we frown upon today. But it was more common back then for cousins and half-sisters. And Abraham leaves his home and travels to a land that God would show him. God says, leave. He goes. He doesn't leave till he's 75. 75 years old. Now, I'm adventurous, and I can be spontaneous, and this can drive Chris a little nuts. But for me to just go with absolutely no plan at all, that takes a little bit more spontaneity and adventure than I'm normal. Normally, I have some sort of an idea where I'm going and what I'm going to do. And God says, go, and I'll show you where. And Abram's like, okay, we'll go. So he leaves, and he goes, and he gets to land, and it's a good land. And he's told, you will have a child, and you'll be the father of many nations, and all nations will be blessed through you. You will wander in the land, and you will dwell in it, and you will prosper. Your family will dwell in it on a more permanent basis, but only after 400 years of slavery. Which brings me to the point of maybe I don't want to know all of God's plans. Because sometimes God has things planned for us that we would say, can we do something different here in this 400 years? But he's promised children, and there are none. 10 years after arriving in Canaan, still has no child. And Sarah gets impatient. And so she gives him her handmaiden Hagar to be his wife. Again, things happened back then that we would frown upon today. Sarah does this, and Abraham unwisely goes along with it. And so Abraham and Hagar have Ishmael. And this happens when Abram is 86. And you can find that in Genesis 16:16. But this creates problems. Who saw that coming, right? And it continues problems throughout Abram's life. And it continues today. In God's timing, Isaac comes along 14 years after Ishmael. When Abram is 100 years old, Isaac comes along. Many years later, after Sarah's death, Abram marries Keturah and has 6 more sons that become nations. So when he's the father of many nations, it's many nations. Yet it's Isaac and Ishmael at the end of Abram's life that come together to bury their father. The other sons that he had, they said he sends them to the east. You can go to that next slide. This is a little more focused on what we're going to talk about today. An interesting note, not everything in Genesis is in time linear order. And that's one of those things I was reminded of when I'm reading this story, because it seemed like that Abraham never met his grandchildren. And I thought, and that's kind of a shame. Because in Genesis 25, 7 through 11 is the story of his death and burial, where Ishmael and Isaac come together to bury him, which I found interesting as well. And then later in the chapter, in chapter 25, verses 19 through 28, it tells the story of Esau and Jacob being born. However, Isaac was born when Abram was 100, and Isaac was 40, so 40 years later, he has Jacob and Esau. But Abraham doesn't die till he's 175, so for 35 years, he does know his grandchildren. It's just his death was recorded before, I guess for the flow of the story. For whatever reason, it's not recorded necessarily in order. So not everything is on a linear timeline. So now on to Isaac. There's several different ways we could approach, perspectives, if you will, that we could approach Isaac. Let's go to that next slide. The not so good. There's a not so good when you read over the story. By the way, did anybody read the story of Isaac the last week? Okay. I think what we're talking about next week is in the bulletin. So you might read through that before you come to class. Because if I had to rely on my recollection of the story of Isaac from the last time I read it before the last few weeks, I would be really rusty on this. So as we go through these, let me encourage you to read ahead a little bit. So, have you ever known a couple that is barren, having trouble conceiving, and then after years and years and years, they have a child? That's an awesome thing, right? But typically what happens to that child? Spoiled. Yes. Spoiled, rotten, usually. Overprotected, right? It took me this long to get you. You're not getting out of my sight, right? And I don't know if that was the case, but I could imagine it might have been. It's not recorded that. I do know that mom gets very jealous of the half-brother and it divides the family. When I was little, my dad would have this habit of picking up a baseball bat or a 2x4 or throwing a fist, and he'd come super close to hitting me, and he wouldn't. And then he missed. I mean, he hit. He didn't miss. He connected with the 2x4. Broke my glasses, bloodied my nose. And I'm like, come on, Dad. You know, you talk about having dad issues. My dad never tried to kill me. Right? I mean, yeah, he hit me in the face with a 2x4. At least I can understand that's an accident. But going up to make an offering, and Isaac is old enough to say, hey, Dad, we've got the fire, we've got the wood. Where's the offering? My dad never bound me and laid me on an altar and raised a knife. Whew, just in time. In God's perfect timing, the angel shows up. But you wonder how that affected Isaac, right? Because that could have gone bad. I mean, would you ever trust your dad again? Hey, let's go fishing. I'll stay home. I'll stay here with Mom, the overprotective one. Yeah, let's go worship. Let me see the ram first, and then we'll go, right? So that there could be some really bad issues that come from that story. Didn't get to choose his own wife. His dad says to his servant, you go over there, you find him a wife from my own people, not from the Canaanites here, and you bring her back. And so this lady shows up, and I don't know, maybe that was normal. Maybe it was an arranged marriage type of situation. Maybe that's totally okay. But it could go bad. Both Isaac and Rebekah have favorite sons. All right? And they're opposites. I don't know that that's bad or worse than both of them favoring one over the other. But this causes problems. This is not the way we should treat our children. Esau, Isaac's son Esau, doesn't seem to be the smartest guy around. And he typically makes some rash decisions, some unwise decisions. He gives up his birthright for stew. Right? It's possibly the second costliest meal in the history of mankind. The first would be the garden and the fruit. Well, there's also the guy that ate and he was so full that he fell in a deep sleep and he had a tent peg driven through his head. So that may be the third costliest meal. Esau marries 2 Hittite women, which bring grief to his parents. And I don't know if it's their difficult personalities. I don't know if they were worshiping a different god. It doesn't say, it just says they brought them grief. Esau, the older brother, wants to and plans to kill his brother. Now, I have a brother, so I understand the feeling, okay? I still remember some fights when we were teenagers that I wanted to kill him. But planning it out is a different step, right? There's a difference between a crime of passion and premeditated. And this was premeditated, and it was going to happen. Jacob, because of this, ends up spending 20 years in exile. So one of Isaac's sons is not that bright, makes rash decisions and wants to kill his brother, and the other one is gone for 20 years. Talk about families and trends and character. What about honesty? Abraham twice claims that Sarah is his sister rather than his wife, which she was both, though there was a little half-truth in there, but there was half dishonesty in there. Later on, Isaac tells Abimelech that Rebekah is his sister. which is not true at all. She's a cousin, but not a sister. That's in 26 verse 7. Rebekah helps Jacob deceive Isaac with the blessing. And Laban, which is Rebekah's brother, he deceives Jacob, who wants to marry Rachel, and sends Leah in instead, and basically swindles him out of 7 more years of labor. This seems to be a trait that's passed on to Jacob. Jacob's name means cheater, interestingly enough. It's almost as if dishonesty and deceit were something that was taught, if not verbally, through patterns of behavior, through actions as acceptable. Jacob swindles his brother out of his birthright. He deceives he deceives Isaac and steals Esau's blessings. He deceives then his father-in-law by how he breeds the sheep. And he amasses great wealth in doing so. So it seems that things from a family perspective don't work out very well for Isaac. He's isolated from his half-brother. His sons are isolated from one another. His wife helps deceive him. One seems to make terrible, rash decisions, and the other is in exile for 20 years. Okay, let's bring a family lesson from that. But first, let's look at a different perspective. Go to that next slide. The positive angle. The positive angle. Isaac. Isaac means laughter. He is circumcised on the 8th day according to the command of God. He is the promised child that his parents have waited for a very, very long time. He is a blessing from God. He was the fulfillment of a promise from God, and he is greatly loved. He has feasts given in his honor for what we would seem as minor milestones, such as the day he was weaned. There was a great feast thrown for him. I don't know, I'm not a nursing mom. Maybe that's a bigger milestone than I would expect. Interesting perspective. His father puts his obedience and devotion to God above the devotion he has for his son. That is never easy for children to understand, but it is the exact right example. We are to be devoted to God above our families. And that's hard, right? That's hard to think about. Isaac sees firsthand God provides. God provides. Abraham has bundled him up and put him on the altar and raises a knife, and God provides. And God hears. And Isaac knows this. God hears. And Isaac hears God promise blessings because of Abraham's faithfulness. He sees his father be faithful to God in a foreign land where all the neighbors are worshiping other gods. He sees his father establish himself in that foreign land and yet make provisions for him to have a wife from his own people without going back to the previous land. He sees the providence of God work out in the story of Rebekah. And he knows that God is working in his life. He has a wife in Rebekah who also sees that the hand of the Lord is active in her life and is willing to leave her people to go be with a man she's never met. He was introspective. He would go out to the fields to meditate. He does this when Rebekah is being brought. That's what he's doing. He's in the field meditating. The first time Rebekah sees him. God answers his prayers favorably. Rebekah was barren. This was one of those details I had forgotten, that Rebekah was barren. They had been married for 20 years with no children. Isaac prays. And they are given twins. The Lord instructed him personally. I don't know if we would think that's a good thing or bad thing, to actually hear the audible voice. Part of me thinks that would be super cool, and part of me thinks, I'm not so sure. The Lord blesses him with wealth, with flocks, with herds, with servants. And he was promised more blessings. Even after he had amassed wealth, he's promised more blessings from the Lord. He worshiped God. He built altars. It was plain to others that the Lord was with him. Abimelech says, it is obvious the Lord is with you. The neighboring king. Peace treaties are made with him because they can see that the Lord is with him. And if we get into a fight with them, the Lord is going to be on their side, not ours. We want peace. Though his boys were angry and separated, they came back together in peace. I don't know if you've ever been separated from a sibling. There's about 5 years where my brother and I, who had been incredibly close, we didn't talk much. They came back together in peace. And though Jacob lived in a foreign land for 20 years, he was faithful to God. That's impressive. I mean, isn't that all of our hopes, that our children will be faithful to God? And though Esau didn't always make the best decisions, in the end, he chose forgiveness and family. Genesis 35, 28 and 29. Now the days of Isaac were 180 years. I don't know if I want to live that long. The days of Isaac were 180 years, and Isaac breathed his last, and he died, and he was gathered to his people, old and full of days. And his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. My grandfather, in his last few years, in conversations, would often look at people he was talking to and say, I've had a good life. I've had a good life. And that's what he was old and full of days reminded me of. I think Isaac had a pretty good life. So we could look at the bad that we talked about earlier and all those weird situations, and we could focus on those, or we could look at the good. And we could focus on the good. Every family has good and bad moments. Every family has children that make different decisions than what their parents would choose for them. Every family has some sort of inner turmoil. Some consequences to one family member's actions may hurt the entire family for years, maybe even generations. Some bad habits of parents will rub off on their children. Yet even in the most dysfunctional families, good traits are also passed on. It's not all bad. It's never all bad. I've seen good families, seemingly good families, whose children don't remain faithful. I've seen seemingly dysfunctional families where their children rise above that dysfunction and have very happy and very faithful lives. So trying to look at these two perspectives and figure out what do we learn from this. Don't let your imperfections keep you from passing on your faith to your children. You're not going to be perfect. I'm not going to be perfect. But I can't let my failures and my shortcomings stop me from passing that faith on to my children. There is no one else more important, qualified, or responsible for teaching your children about God than you are, because God has given you that responsibility. Studies show that still today, in today's society, with all our technologies and all the problems that come with it, that parents are still the number one influence that teens will list on them. I didn't say that very well, but I hope you understood it. Self-reporting, teens will say their most influential people in their lives are their parents. Don't think it's the telephone. Don't think it's technology. Don't think it's their friends. Don't think they aren't listening. They are. They're listening and they care, and you are important to them. There's another perspective I want to look at. Go to that next. God's involvement. I want to start this, though, with going to Hebrews chapter 13. And you might mark that because we may come back to it. Hebrews 13 and verse 8. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. And we know that Jesus and God are one. And we know the Godhead, the Father, the Son, the Spirit, and we know they are one. We know that even in creation, they were all there. The Spirit of God was hovering over the water. God said, "Let there be light." And in John, it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and nothing was created that has been created without the Word. And the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us." It's talking about Jesus. He was there in the beginning. Jesus and God and the Spirit are one and the same. And they are the same today and yesterday and forever. Now let's go to Genesis 12. And we're going to be zipping through again the story of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Esau. In Genesis 12:1 is the first time that God says, Abram, go, and I'll make you into a great nation. And God eventually shows him the place, but first he just says, go. And God promises children to Abram in Genesis 12:2, in 15:3 through 6, and in 17:16. Because he promises, and then Abram's going, but you haven't given me a child. And God promises again. And then he says, but you haven't given me a child. And God promises again. My promise hasn't changed. One of my favorite things about this story is in chapter 18, verse 14. It teaches us a little bit about God. Sarah's 90, and again, she's being promised children, and she laughs. Anybody in here 90? Any ladies in here 90? What would you think if an angel or the Lord or whatever it was talking said you were going to have a child? I don't know if you'd laugh or cry, right? Definitely cry. But in 18:14, after Sarah laughs, the Lord asks, why did she laugh? Is anything too hard for the Lord? Is anything too hard for the Lord? And throughout this story, several different times of Abram, Isaac, and Jacob, it is said that God opens wombs so that children can be born. What a blessing from God our children are. Abraham's servant prayed to God and asked some very specific things to happen in regard to finding Isaac a wife in chapter 24. And before he's even done saying it in his heart, it happens. And when the story is told, well, in 24:21 it says, he gazed at her in silence to learn whether the Lord had prospered him on his journey or not. He prays, let this very specific thing happen, and it happens, and he's sitting back in silence staring going, I don't know if he's going, did that really just happen? What it says he was thinking was to learn whether the Lord had prospered him on his journey. Is this really from you? And then when he retells the story to Rebekah's relatives, their response in 24, 50, and 51 is amazing. This thing has come from the Lord. We cannot speak to you bad or good. Behold, Rebekah is before you. Take her and go. Let her be the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has spoken. Which is really interesting because they take an event that happened. Here was a prayer, and the prayer was answered. And when the story is told that this very specific prayer was answered in a very specific way, her relatives attribute it to the Lord speaking. We don't give God nearly the credit he deserves. Rebekah goes to the Lord in 25:23 to ask about the turmoil in her womb and is told, you have two nations warring within you. You have twins, and they're wrestling around. God advised Isaac what land to dwell in when a famine came in chapter 26, 1 through 5. And the Lord blessed him. Not only did he say, go and be in this land, but the Lord blessed him even with this famine going on, that he reaped 100-fold. And he becomes incredibly wealthy. So much so that Abimelech, the king of that land, sends him away. He says, you have grown too powerful. You go back to where you came from. And even in that, when he's having to pack up and leave, God comes to him and promises him more blessings in 26:24. And then later on in the same chapter, Abimelech comes to meet him. And at first he's like, whoa, well, where are you following me? And that's when he says, we see plainly the Lord has been with you. You are now the blessed of the Lord. You are now the blessed of the Lord. This is coming from the neighboring king. You are now the blessed of the Lord. Let's have a peace treaty. And they work out a peace treaty. And then Jacob has a dream, the ladder to heaven with the angels, and he hears the promise of God in Genesis 28:10 and 17. And I mentioned earlier that Jacob somehow swindles Laban out of the best of the sheep by the way he bred it. But in Genesis 31, Genesis 31, 4 through 13, Jacob attributes that to God blessing him because of the way Laban had kept switching his pay scale. And that he had done only what the Lord had commanded. And Jacob prays for God to deliver him from Esau in Genesis 32. And in Genesis 35, God blesses and renames Jacob Israel. And in Genesis 24, I wanted to go back to that. All of those things, God blessing and rename Jacob, happened before Isaac dies. Isaac sees God's involvement in his father's life, in his life, in his children's lives. And back to Hebrews 13. God is the same yesterday and today and forever. How is it that when the servant goes to the land and his prayer is, let the first person to show up be the person you've appointed? And out walks Rebecca and does exactly, he put some other qualifying things in there to know, hey, is this the person? Is this who you want? And they come out and they do exactly the things he prayed for. What happened earlier in the day to make Rebecca get there at exactly that time? Was she headed there earlier and something slowed her down? Was she planning to go later? Something prompted her to go early. I remember there was a story, I was getting ready to go to the auto parts store, and a friend of mine called me. And I pick up the phone, and about 10 minutes into our conversation, I hear sirens. And a half an hour after, because he was one of those guys that you could never get off the phone, just talk. I hang up the phone, I go to the auto parts store, and the fire and the police are everywhere, and a lady had thought she was hitting the brake, and she was on the gas, and she was in reverse, and she went out into the street and clipped a couple cars from a parking lot and backed through the entrance of the auto parts store, and her front bumper, or her back bumper, was on top of the counter in the auto parts store. And had that phone not rang, I would have been standing right there. And I went home and I called my buddy back and said, you can call me anytime. Right? Now, was it God that made Eddie call me so that I was on the phone and I wasn't standing there? I can't tell you that it was. But God works in our lives. God's providence is at work in our lives. He is the same today as he was in Isaac's story. He knows who you are. He knows how he wants to bless you. He knows your cares. He knows your worries. He knows your hurt over your children. God loves us and has plans for us just as much as he did Isaac and Jacob and Abraham. We serve the same God. And my time is up. So I'll leave you with that. Have a blessed evening.